It was a quiet Saturday morning when I first noticed something was off in the neighborhood. Our HOA community was usually full of strange drama, grass length disputes, mailbox paint arguments, and the occasional fight over who left trash cans out too long. But lately it felt like things had escalated into a full-blown soap opera starring none other than Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of all HOA rules. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her, and everyone avoided her when possible. Her blonde bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and permanently furrowed brows gave her the aura of a suburban dictator. She strutted around the cul-de-sac with a clipboard as if she were on government payroll, snapping pictures of yards, barking at kids riding bikes, and threatening to report anyone who violated her interpretation of the HOA handbook. Most of us ignored her antics, but my family always seemed to be in her crosshairs, and I knew why. She couldn't stand that my mother, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with decades of community leadership experience, was the actual elected president of HOA. Karen wanted that power for herself, and she made no effort to hide her resentment. She constantly tried to undermine my mother by spreading rumors, filing fake complaints, and even claiming that Mom was running the HOA like a dictatorship. The irony was lost on her completely. But it wasn't Karen's pettiness that drew the line for me, it was her son, Jason. Jason was the neighborhood's spoiled adult child, a 22-year-old who still lived at home, drove his mom's car, and strutted around like he was invincible. He had a long history of causing trouble, speeding through the neighborhood, blasting music at midnight, and vandalizing mailboxes. Whenever anyone complained, Karen always brushed it off. "He's just a kid," she'd say, as though adulthood hadn't already landed on him like a brick. My mother had warned Karen several times that Jason's behavior was escalating, but Karen just smirked and said, "Well, my son doesn't answer to you. Maybe you should remember who really runs this HOA." Of course, she thought it was her. What she didn't know was that Jason's recklessness was about to catch up with him in a way even Karen couldn't spin. The first sign of trouble came when I returned home from work one evening and noticed muddy footprints near our back fence. At first, I brushed it off. Kids sometimes cut through yards in the neighborhood, but the prints were larger, more like an adult's. I mentioned it to my mom, and she frowned, instantly suspicious. "Keep an eye out," she said. "Karen's been particularly bitter since the last HOA meeting. She accused me of rigging the election again." I laughed it off, but her words stuck with me. A couple nights later, I was up late watching TV when I heard a faint scraping sound near the side window. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch in the wind, but the noise grew louder. Then came a faint metallic click, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open a locked window. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone and crept quietly toward the sound, careful not to make the floor creak. As I peeked around the corner, I caught a glimpse of a figure dressed in dark clothes crouched by the window. The porch light illuminated his face for just a moment, and my blood boiled. It was Jason. My neighbor's arrogant, reckless son was trying to break into my house. I froze for a split second, torn between storming out to confront him and calling the police. Before I could decide, Jason jiggled the window one more time, then muttered something under his breath and moved toward the back door. That was it. I dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I described the intruder. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. Jason, apparently too dim-witted to realize he had set off a silent alarm of neighborhood proportions, was caught red-handed by the officers as he fiddled with the lock on our back door. I watched from inside as the cops shouted commands, handcuffed him, and shoved him into the back of the cruiser. My heart was still racing, but there was a certain satisfaction in seeing him finally face consequences. But then came the chaos. Just as the officers were pulling away, Karen came storming down the street in her bathrobe, screeching at the top of her lungs. "What do you think you're doing? That's my son. You can't arrest him. My family runs this HOA. I demand you let him go right now." The officers tried to calm her down, but she was relentless, waving her arms and shouting at neighbors who had started peeking out their windows. "This is harassment. My son has every right to be here. That woman," she jabbed a finger toward our house, "is lying, and I'll have her removed from the HOA for this. I opened the door and stepped outside, my mom right behind me. Calmly, my mother crossed her arms and looked Karen dead in the eye. Your son broke into my home. He's lucky we called the police and not someone else who might have handled it differently. Karen's face twisted with rage, and she spat back, You're not the real president of the HOA. I am. And when I'm done with you, you'll regret ever crossing my family. The cops weren't amused. One of them finally said, Ma'am, if you don't calm down, you're going to be joining your son tonight. That shut her up for a brief moment, though her glare could have burned a hole through steel. As they drove Jason away, she turned and hissed, This isn't over. And in that moment, I knew she meant it. But what she didn't know was that her son's break-in was about to unravel everything she had worked so hard to fake. Her power, her influence, and her carefully crafted lies. The following morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like a hive after someone had kicked it, word spreading faster than wildfire that Jason had been arrested for attempted burglary, and of course the person fueling most of the gossip was none other than Karen herself, though her version of events was dramatically altered to suit her narrative. According to her, Jason had merely been checking on the safety of the neighborhood when he was unfairly targeted, and my mother, whom she referred to as that power-hungry woman, had orchestrated the entire thing to humiliate her family. But anyone who had actually seen the squad car lights flashing outside my home knew the truth, and the sight of Jason being hauled away in handcuffs was not something that could easily be explained away with one of Karen's half-baked excuses. Still, Karen doubled down, strutting from porch to porch the next day with her clipboard in hand, demanding that neighbors sign a petition to remove my mom as HOA president, and though some people took the paper just to get her off their doorstep, most rolled their eyes and shut the door before she could launch into one of her dramatic monologues. Because the reality was that Karen's credibility had already been circling the drain, and now it had taken a nosedive. Meanwhile, my mom wasn't rattled. If anything, she was calmer than ever, sipping her morning coffee on the porch and smiling politely at neighbors who stopped by to thank her for standing up. To Karen and her son's reckless behavior, though I knew beneath that calm exterior she was seething, not out of fear, but out of sheer frustration that Karen would go so far as to excuse an actual crime. She thinks she's untouchable, my mom said to me that afternoon as we sorted through paperwork for the upcoming HOA budget meeting. But now her son is in real trouble and she can't spin her way out of this one, no matter how many petitions she waves around. She was right. Jason was facing charges, and because he had been caught in the act with attempted forced entry, it wasn't going to be dismissed as some childish prank. Later that week, I overheard Karen shouting at the police officer who served her son's court summons, demanding to know if special considerations could be made since she was effectively in charge of this neighborhood, to which the officer chuckled and told her the law didn't care who chaired the HOA, leaving her fuming on her front lawn as neighbors discreetly filmed her meltdown from their windows. Things escalated further when Jason was released on bail pending his court date, because instead of laying low, he strutted around like a rooster, trying to regain some sense of pride, blasting music from his car again, and even glaring at our house whenever he drove past, which only reinforced to everyone that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a pattern of entitlement and arrogance inherited straight from his mother. Karen, meanwhile, began a smear campaign against my family, printing out flyers accusing my mom of corruption, taping them to mailboxes, and even sending out mass emails filled with lies about how my mom had conspired with police to frame her son. And though the majority of the neighborhood ignored it, there were always a handful of residents who thrived on drama and loved to stir the pot, so they whispered and speculated at HOA meetings, making everything even messier. My mom, however, was nothing if not resilient. She walked into the next HOA board meeting dressed sharply, papers neatly organized, and without a hint of hesitation in her voice, she calmly addressed the issue before Karen could open her mouth, saying, For those of you who may have heard rumors, yes, Jason was arrested, and yes, it was for attempting to break into my home. That is a matter for the courts to decide. But as far as this HOA is concerned, our focus remains on maintaining the neighborhood, not indulging in personal vendettas. The room was silent, except for Karen's indignant gasp as she jumped to her feet, waving her arms like a malfunctioning traffic signal. Lies. She's lying. My son is innocent, and this is nothing but a smear against me, the rightful leader of this community, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. But by then, even the most patient neighbors had had enough. One elderly man in the back muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe if you spent less time trying to run this place and more time running your household, we wouldn't be dealing with this nonsense," which earned a ripple of chuckles across the room and left Karen sputtering. In disbelief, the more she tried to assert control, the more obvious it became that she had lost it entirely, and the more isolated she became, the bolder Jason grew, almost as though he thought he could reclaim the family's reputation by intimidating others into silence. But the law wasn't on his side, and with every passing day, the court date loomed larger, promising consequences that no amount of Karen's shouting could erase. Late one evening, as I was taking out the trash, Jason cornered me at the curb, his face twisted with resentment. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" He sneered, stepping closer until I could smell the stale beer on his breath. "You called the cops on me, and now everyone thinks I'm some kind of criminal. You don't get it. Man, my mom runs this neighborhood. We run this place." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Jason, your mom doesn't run anything. She doesn't even run her own life. You broke into my house, and now you're facing the consequences. That's on you, not me." His fists clenched, and for a second I thought he might swing, but just then a neighbor across the street turned on their porch light, and Jason backed off, muttering under his breath as he stormed away. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about a crime anymore. It was about power, pride, and the unraveling of a facade that had held the neighborhood hostage for years, and the cracks were spreading faster than Karen or her son could patch them. By the time Jason's court date finally arrived, the neighborhood had practically turned it into a spectator sport, with people whispering about it at the mailboxes, sharing updates on the community Facebook page, and even taking bets on whether he would get jail time or just probation, because everyone wanted to see how justice would be served after years of entitlement and arrogance. My mom, though, handled it with her usual composure, refusing to comment on the gossip and reminding everyone that the legal system would take care of things, though even she admitted privately that she hoped the judge would make an example out of him, not out of malice, but because letting Jason off easy would only embolden him further. On the morning of the hearing, Karen strutted into the courthouse like it was her kingdom, dragging Jason along by the arm as if the sight of her son's presence there wasn't humiliating enough, and she wore her signature oversized sunglasses even indoors, carrying a massive binder stuffed with papers she claimed were proof that the whole thing was a setup. She'd even convinced two of her drama-loving neighbors to come as character witnesses, though everyone knew their testimony would be as flimsy as her credibility. I sat quietly in the back row with my mom, watching the circus unfold, and I couldn't help but notice how pale Jason looked compared to his mother's forced bravado. His usual smug swagger was gone, replaced with sweaty palms and darting eyes, because for the first time in his life, he couldn't rely on Mommy to shield him from consequences. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, called the case, and as the prosecutor laid out the evidence, police body cam footage showing Jason fiddling with our back door, my 911 call recording, and even fingerprints on the window Jason had tried to open, it became painfully clear that this wasn't some misunderstanding. Karen, of course, couldn't resist interrupting, leaping to her feet and shouting, "Objection! This is all fabricated. My son was protecting the neighborhood, not breaking into it." The judge fixed her with a glare that could freeze lava. "Ma'am, you are not an attorney, and if you interrupt these proceedings again, I will have you removed from this courtroom." That shut her up, at least temporarily, though she continued to whisper furiously to Jason as though she could coach him through the ordeal. When it was Jason's turn to speak, his defense lawyer, a weary public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to paint him as a misguided young man making a poor decision, but Jason's own arrogance undermined him. Instead of showing remorse, Jason shrugged and said, "Look, it wasn't a big deal. I was just trying to make a point. My mom runs the HOA, so technically it's like we own the neighborhood anyway." A stunned silence filled the room, followed by an audible groan from the prosecutor, and the judge's expression hardened into stone. "Mr. Wallace," she said slowly, "what you just admitted to is not only inaccurate, but profoundly troubling. You are not above the law, nor is your mother. Attempting to break into someone's home is a crime, regardless of your perceived authority. This court will not tolerate such disregard for basic principles of law and order." Karen's face flushed crimson, and she jumped up again, shouting, "You don't understand. Without me, this HOA would fall apart. We make the rules here, not you." The bailiff moved toward her, and the judge slammed her gavel. "Remove her from this courtroom." The image of Karen being escorted out, still screaming about how she ran the neighborhood, was seared into my memory forever. And though Jason tried to hide it, the panic in his eyes betrayed him. Without his mother to screech on his behalf, he looked small, pathetic even. After deliberation, the judge sentenced Jason to 6 months in county jail with an additional year of probation, citing his complete lack of remorse and the seriousness of breaking into an occupied home. And though some people thought 6 months wasn't much in Jason's privileged little world, it was an eternity. Karen wasn't allowed back into the courtroom until after sentencing, and when she finally reappeared in the hallway, mascara streaked down her face, she screamed at me and my mom as if we'd personally plotted his downfall. "This is your fault. You ruined my son's life. You think you've won. But this isn't over," she shrieked, her voice echoing down the marble corridor, while Jason was led away in handcuffs, eyes fixed on the ground. I almost felt sorry for him, not because he didn't deserve the punishment, but because he had been raised in a bubble of entitlement so thick that he genuinely didn't know the difference between right and wrong, and now he was going to learn it the hard way. The news spread like wildfire back home, and by evening the entire neighborhood was buzzing again, except this time the tone was different. People weren't just gossiping, they were relieved, almost celebratory, as if a dark cloud that had hung over the community for years had finally lifted. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate my mom for standing her ground, some even bringing over casseroles and pies in a strange but welcome gesture of solidarity. And for the first time in a long time, the cul-de-sac felt united instead of divided by Karen's endless drama. But Karen, true to form, didn't back down. Within days, she was posting rants online about how the justice system was corrupt, how the judge was biased, and how my mom had orchestrated everything to seize power, and though fewer and fewer people paid attention, her bitterness only grew more toxic. She marched around the neighborhood like a ghost of her former self, yelling at kids for riding scooters too fast, threatening to fine people for having the wrong kind of porch lights, and glaring daggers at our house every time she passed, but the difference now was that nobody listened anymore. She had lost her credibility, her influence, and her son, who was now sitting in a cell where his only audience was a set of gray walls and fellow inmates who didn't care that his mommy ran the HOA. Watching it all unfold, I realized that justice wasn't just about Jason serving time. It was about finally exposing Karen for who she really was, a self-deluded tyrant whose reign had collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. And though she still hissed about revenge whenever she saw us, she no longer had the army of enablers she once commanded. The neighborhood had moved on, and Karen was left screaming into the void, powerless at last. In the weeks following Jason's sentencing, life in the neighborhood began to settle into a peaceful rhythm that many of us hadn't experienced in years. The tension that had once hung heavy in the air finally dissipating now that Karen's son was behind bars and her grip on the HOA had been shattered. But if there was one thing everyone knew about Karen, it was that she was incapable of admitting defeat. Instead, she grew more desperate, clawing for scraps of control in increasingly erratic ways, like showing up uninvited at board meetings to scream about how the bylaws were invalid, or storming through the neighborhood snapping pictures of people's yards and claiming she was documenting violations even though no one took her seriously anymore. My mom, ever the professional, refused to stoop to Karen's level, handling each outburst with the same calm authority that had won the respect of most residents, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. Late nights spent drafting official letters to counter Karen's nonsense, endless phone calls from neighbors asking what to do about Karen's harassment, and a constant worry that Karen would do something even more reckless than her son. That worry proved justified one Friday evening when Karen decided to stage what she must have thought was her grand comeback. She called the cops on us. It was almost comical. The way the patrol car pulled up in front of our house, lights flashing, and two officers walked up with weary expressions that told me they already knew this was going to be nonsense. Karen stood on her lawn in full theatrical mode, shrieking about how we were running an illegal operation out of our garage, that my mom was embezzling HOA funds and hiding them in secret, and that she demanded an immediate investigation. The officers looked at us apologetically as my mom invited them inside, showing them nothing more suspicious than stacks of HOA paperwork and a very organized filing cabinet. One of the officers, clearly fed up with Karen's antics, finally told her, "Ma'am, you've wasted police resources again, and if you keep making false reports, you'll be the one facing charges." The look on her face was priceless, caught off guard, betrayed by the very system she thought she could weaponize, and yet she still tried to protest, insisting, "But you don't understand, my family runs this neighborhood." To which the officer simply shook his head and walked away. After that humiliation, Karen's descent into bitterness accelerated. She became a pariah, neighbors crossing the street to avoid her, kids mocking her behind her back, and even her two loyal supporters abandoning her after realizing she had no power left to offer them. The final blow came when the HOA board, tired of her disruptions and harassment, voted unanimously to censure her and bar her from attending meetings unless invited, a decision that left her red-faced and sputtering but completely powerless to fight. Meanwhile, Jason was adjusting poorly to life in jail, his reputation trickling back to us through whispers from relatives and online records. He had gotten into fights, been placed in solitary once, and was no longer strutting with arrogance, but instead begging for early release. Karen visited him religiously, posting on Facebook afterward about how her baby boy was surviving like a true warrior, but we all knew the truth. Her golden image of power and control had crumbled, and all she had left was denial. I remember one evening, weeks later, when she confronted us on the sidewalk, her face gaunt, her voice hoarse from screaming into the void of her self-delusion. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my mom. "But when Jason gets out, we'll rebuild everything you destroyed. He'll take his rightful place in this community, and everyone will see the truth." My mom didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't even bother arguing. She simply looked at Karen with pity, the kind you give someone who's lost everything to their own arrogance, and said, "Karen, your son isn't coming back as a leader of anything. He'll be lucky if he comes back with a second chance, and if you cared about him at all, you'd stop feeding him this fantasy and let him learn to stand on his own." Karen's eyes welled with tears, but instead of softening, she turned and stormed off, muttering curses under her breath. That was the last major confrontation we had with her, because after that she faded into the background, reduced to bitter Facebook rants that no one liked and occasional appearances at the mailbox where she avoided eye contact with everyone. The neighborhood moved on, thriving in her absence, kids playing freely again, neighbors hosting barbecues without fear of her clipboard inspections, and my mom leading the HOA with the respect and trust she had earned. As for Jason, when he finally got out, he didn't strut back like a conquering hero. He slinked home with his head down, avoiding everyone, the swagger gone from his step, and within a few months he moved away entirely, leaving Karen alone in the very neighborhood she once claimed to rule. In a way, justice had been poetic. She had shouted for years that her family ran the HOA, that her son was untouchable, that we all had to bow to her authority, but in the end the law had stripped away those delusions, and Jason, instead of inheriting her imaginary empire, had inherited only a criminal record and a jail cell. Standing on my porch one quiet evening, I watched the sun set over the cul-de-sac, the air peaceful, the street calm, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of closure. Karen might still mutter and glare, but she no longer had power, no longer had an audience, and no longer cast the shadow she once did. My mom had stood her ground, the truth had prevailed, and the neighborhood had finally broken free from the tyranny of a woman who believed rules were her weapon. And as I turned to go inside, I realized something else too. Karen's downfall hadn't just freed us from her grasp, it had proven once and for all that arrogance, entitlement, and lies can only hold power for so long before reality tears them apart.